My name is Paul Gillard, and I'm the Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Sociology. I'm here to welcome you all to this event and to introduce our guest speaker in just a moment. A couple things before I introduce Dr. Pellow. First, I wanted to give a special welcome. We have 13 of our best applicants to our graduate program who are visiting, who are mostly in the front row and eagerly awaiting the talk, and wanted to give a special welcome. Some of them traveled about a quarter to a half of the country to be here, so we're really appreciative of that and excited about that. I want to welcome the faculty and graduate students in sociology and all sorts of people who I don't recognize who hopefully saw a poster or an email and appreciate you being here from other parts of campus. I want to thank the Department of Sociology and the Center for the Study of Social Justice, which is housed in the Department of Sociology, for being the key sponsors of this event, making it possible, and a little bit to the college for helping out with our recruitment days today and tomorrow. And I'll just ask actually the folks who are visiting and current grad students to gather at the front at the end so we can make sure everybody knows where they're going next. And now I'll turn to introducing David Pellow, who I'm really thrilled has made it back to Knoxville. I've been reading David's work for years and finally met at the sociology meetings in Denver last year. And David is, if I can get this right, Don Martindale Endowed Chair Professor of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. He's an environmental sociologist, which is one of our key areas in sociology here at Tennessee. He's been writing on the theme of inequality and environmental justice and environmental sociology for a number of years, and embarked on that. He was an undergraduate here at the University of Tennessee, got his degree here in 1992, and then went off to Northwestern to study with Alan Schneeberg, and has been at a couple places before spending the last 5 years in Minnesota. His early work in the books Urban Recycling and Garbage Wars focused on garbage and recycling. He's written about immigrant workers in high-tech industries and the globalization of those industries in Silicon Valley of Dreams. He's written about transnational movements in resisting global toxics, and he's written about immigrants in the construction and service sector of the country and maybe the world's most wealthiest citizens in Aspen, which he'll be talking about today. His work challenges us to examine the racialized political economy of environments by asking how capital externalizes costs of production, of waste, and of life in racially and ethnically defined and divided ways. And his work shows us how to merge environmental justice concerns with race theories. I think, actually I went back to one of the early books, The Garbage Wars, and I think it fits as an opening to this talk as well, that he quoted, actually I couldn't find a photo of someone saying, from a sociological perspective, it's never sufficient to point to the environment as having been protected. The question must be asked, for whom and by whom? And I think that's what may be part of the theme today in the Slums of Aspen, Immigrants versus the Environment in America's Eden. David Pellow.
Great, thank you so much for that generous introduction, Paul, and thanks to all of you for showing up today. It's a real pleasure and indeed an honor to be returning to my alma mater. I also, before beginning, I do want to say thank you to the Department of Sociology and to the Center for the Study of Social Justice for sponsoring this event. Yes, it's been some time since I've been on this campus, but again, it's a pleasure for me to be here. I have fond memories not only of being on this campus, but being in this room. And to date myself a bit, I think I was just saying earlier, I remember an event in this room where there was a panel of people and we were talking about the anti-apartheid movement being a part of that, and when are we going to get Mandela out of jail and move South Africa and perhaps the rest of the world toward democracy. So it's been a little while since I've been in this room. A bit about myself. I've always had a deep and abiding interest in social movements that are concerned with and confronting inequality in the society, having grown up in a family that has been deeply involved for decades in civil rights and human rights and socialist movements in the UK and the American South. And that, of course, influenced my involvement in anti-racist movements here in the United States, including the anti-apartheid movement, which I was involved with on this campus. I've also always had a deep and abiding interest in social movements that confront environmental harm or lack of environmental sustainability. Largely from, I would say I would originate that in my being raised during my childhood by parents who gave me a deep appreciation and love for the creeks, the waterways, the rivers, the lakes, the ponds, and the Great Smoky Mountains that I swam in, picnicked in, hiked in, and camped in as a kid. But it wasn't until I enrolled at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, that I began to understand the link between social inequality and environmental harm. That understanding emerged from taking courses from professors in the Department of Sociology and across various other fields, and from my engagement with several student-run organizations on campus, and participation with numerous social movements and organizations off campus here in Knoxville. I remember being involved with a bunch of hellraisers over in Fort Knox who were concerned with all sorts of things, including apartheid, forest policy, gender justice, you name it. So I owe much of my learning, the ideas, the commitments, my development to this topic, my engagement in this topic, to this great university and this welcoming community, so thank you. Soon after graduating from UT, I went to graduate school and immediately began, like the first week of being in grad school, immediately began doing field work for a group called People for Community Recovery, which is an environmental justice organization on the south side of Chicago, who was focused on bringing attention to the problem of environmental racism and environmental inequality. And by that I mean simply that, generally speaking, oftentimes when we find and where we find social inequality in this society and many others, we also often find that people are struggling not just for their civil rights and human rights, but for their right to clean air, to clean land, to clean water, and for basic access to ecosystems that are unpolluted. Fighting for those rights in deeply toxic, deeply polluted workplaces and communities. Chicago's South Side is, and certainly was, no exception. Literally hundreds, if not thousands, of sources, point and non-point sources of industrial pollution in the area, with tons, literally tons of toxins emitted into the air, dumped on the land and into the water on an annual basis. And not surprisingly then, a human population suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders, asthma, various skin ailments, rashes, cancers, a range of illnesses, and even more deeply suffering from the feeling, suffering from the sense that they matter less than the rest of us in this society. So People for Community Recovery, PCR, this organization that really in many ways was the place where I did my graduate work, became a part of this national and international movement for environmental justice, confronting corporations, and they alleged we were polluting and destroying the quality of life in their neighborhoods, and also confronting a regulatory system that allowed for and facilitated for such deep disparities in environmental protection. So I was privileged to join that group and to do research on their struggles. But after a number of years, I noticed, or at least I began to believe, that those of us who are active in the movement for environmental justice and those of us who refer to themselves as scholars of environmental justice studies, were missing something. And so let me back up to explain that. So scholars working in this field have, at least in the United States, for going on 4 decades at least, have demonstrated, have documented, and presented evidence that poor people, people of color, indigenous folks, working class folks, immigrants, women, and other marginalized communities tend to face greater threats from pollution and industrial hazards than other groups. While these studies reveal the hardships, and some would say the crimes, associated with environmental inequality, or more particularly in some cases environmental racism, fewer studies consider the flip side of that reality and what we call environmental privilege. So, environmental privilege results from the exercise of economic, political, and cultural power that some groups enjoy that enables them access, near exclusive access, to a whole host of coveted amenities, such as forests, parks, mountains, trails, coastal property, open lands, elite neighborhoods. Environmental privilege is embodied in the fact that some groups can access these spaces and resources that are protected from the kinds of ecological harm that other groups are forced to contend with every day. These advantages may also include things like organic or pesticide-free foods, neighborhoods with healthier air quality, energy that is siphoned from the living environments of other people. And I see that happening every day in a place like Minnesota, where I'm able to warm myself in my house because native folks just to the east of me have a nuclear reactor on their land, or folks far north of me, native folks, have hydroelectric dams that have been without consent placed on their land. So in this research I want to talk about today, I want to show how environmental privileges accrue to the few while environmental burdens confront the many, including lack of access to these amenities I've just discussed. So if environmental inequality or environmental racism are abundant, and we can readily observe them around this nation and indeed around the globe, then surely the same could be said for environmental privilege. And so we argue that we cannot have one without the other. They are two sides of the same coin. So my co-author and I, Lisa Sunhee Park, we had the opportunity to explore this phenomenon some years ago when a resident of the Roaring Fork Valley in Colorado. Roaring Fork Valley is the valley that extends from Aspen on down the Roaring Fork River, at least to Parachute, maybe beyond, along Highway 82 in Colorado. Well, this guy was at a conference at the University of Colorado where we were at the time, and he said, you know, you really should check into this incredible case where the City Council of Aspen unanimously passed a resolution declaring two things. First, that Aspen should continue to be a model sustainable green city. And second, that in order to maintain that status, immigration from south of the border would have to be severely curtailed. So we were curious about this because we said, wow, this sounds like nativist environmentalism. And by nativist environmentalism, we mean this intersection, this marriage, if you will, of nativism, that is immigration control politics, or some might say anti-immigrant sentiment, and environmentalism. These things coming together, which isn't strange at all. And if you know your US history, if you know your Russian, your German history, your Australian history, this is a worldwide global phenomenon with various variations. But it's nothing that we are strangers to. What we thought was curious, though, that this was taking root in a wealthy but also politically left-leaning, certainly liberal-leaning enclave. So we began our research by asking, why did this happen? What were some of the historical forces that produced this contemporary outcome? To what extent were there countervailing forces in this community? And how were they framing this issue? And then finally, what does all of this mean about ongoing debates, popular and scholarly and otherwise, around immigration, citizenship, race, and the environment, globalization? Right? So our study examines the peculiar role of immigration politics and nativism specifically in maintaining and rationalizing this thing we call environmental privilege, and how this historically embedded nativism within the U.S. environmental movement in turn perpetuates that problem of environmental privilege. So we conducted field work, several visits from 2000 to 2004, and then periodically through 2009, which included an archival exploration of the area's history and a series of interviews and focus groups with key players in the local debates around immigration, labor, and the environment, and ethnographic observations. And that research culminated in the publication of our book, The Slums of Aspen, in 2011. So can I see a show of hands? Who here has ever visited Aspen, Colorado? Excellent. All right, quite a few people. It's lovely. And I want you to know that despite what I'm going to say about Aspen, I actually like Aspen. I love the place. And I plan on going back, so just know that. It's a city, it's a town that sits high in the Rocky Mountains, Colorado, and is certainly a mecca for skiers, for hikers, for nature enthusiasts, environmentalists, European concert music lovers, that's classical music, and economic, political, and cultural elites from here and everywhere else. The average price of a home there just a few years ago was around $4 million. Even the homes in the trailer parks near Aspen sell for $300,000 and up. And people who call themselves doctors, lawyers, and architects tend to inhabit them. Above all, Aspen is a place for relaxation, rejuvenation, and the enjoyment of nature's beauty. That is, unless you happen to be an immigrant laborer whose very purpose there is to make possible and facilitate that rendezvous with Mother Nature for the rest of Aspen's visitors. But on any given day, one can walk the streets of this beautiful city and see purebred dogs adorned with bejeweled collars, drinking purified water from bowls set out by local cafes, people inside such establishments drinking their lattes and juice, Anglo workers in the front, Latinos in the back, not very different from what we're seeing in many other parts of the country. People fresh from their plastic surgeons' offices, strolling the promenades, wearing clothes from high-end boutiques, with the snow-capped mountains towering in the background. This is a great, great getaway, if you can afford it. One May morning, Lisa Park and I drove, we walked, we biked through Aspen's neighborhoods and marveled at the size of homes there, including many new homes under construction. This would have been 2009. This was amazing because this scenario seemed to be oblivious to the ongoing devastation of the housing market, the global and certainly national economic recession. It was just booming. And as always, there were numerous Latino men landscaping, doing remodeling work in the community, Latinas walking from house to house as they finished doing one domestic service job, moving on to the next. I was also there for a conference at the Aspen Institute, the Aspen Meadows. The same pattern prevailed. As we strolled through downtown Aspen, we saw tourists and residents mingling, shopping, eating. On Hyman Avenue, people streaming in and out of the Wheeler Opera House, which sits opposite a row of upscale restaurants on Mill Street, just a block from the historic Hotel Jerome. We saw a blonde woman getting into an RV, not an RV, an SUV, with a sign on the side that read Nordic Gardens Landscape Services, and then 3 Latino men jumping into the back, perhaps heading out to a job with their boss. We pick up a local real estate publication with an advertisement in it on the front page, pointing out that there's an exclusive development, which is interesting to say in Aspen, there's an exclusive development. In an area, we found this an advertisement for a luxury estate that was on sale with a $1 million discount. So there was a huge red slash through the original price, which was $11 million. And now the new, apparently much more affordable price of $10 million was being advertised, and come one, come all. As one critical Aspenite put it, quote, "It's the twilight zone up here when you start looking at real estate. It's just incomprehensible. There's no way that a person who's actually reliant on income from a job could ever purchase here," end quote. One Aspen City Council member told us, quote, "Unfortunately, it is a resort community, and it is a community not unlike Beverly Hills or even Manhattan, where many, if not most of the people who work here cannot afford to live there," end quote. Many places around the planet would fit that bill. So the visual images that Gloss magazine covers in Aspen feature Range Rover limousines, toy poodles, world-class ski slopes, and of course film celebrities, Kevin Costner, Don Johnson, other people like that, who live part of the year in multi-million-dollar single-family homes. One writer eloquently put it this way, quote, "Aspen may be the only ski town that has become a verb. To Aspenize in the eyes of those who live elsewhere, is to destroy a nice little ski town with conspicuous wealth, development, and self-indulgence, end quote. But at the same time, Aspen is also a place where foreign-born workers often drive 60, sometimes 140 miles round trip daily to work in low-status, low-wage jobs with few to no benefits. Many of these workers, one might argue, and I certainly would, live in less than ideal, if not deplorable, housing conditions, including, at times, cars, campers, and trailer parks that are admittedly, even the city council admits, are in flood zones. And that is becoming more and more of an environmental justice issue. And not just in places like New Orleans. This is an environmental justice issue among Roma populations in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, living in flood zones. When we asked an immigrant resident/worker what he thought about the natural beauty of Aspen, I mean, we were sitting there interviewing this gentleman at the base of a mountain. What do you think about the mountains? And he looked at us deadpan. No irony, no smile on his face. Mountain? What mountain? He was dead serious. So there are at least two Aspens. One marked by environmental privilege and exclusion, the other marked by poverty and marginalization. So why focus on Aspen? I mean, Aspen is one of the nation's wealthiest, whitest, environmentally privileged communities. Is actually very much like so much of the rest of this country in at least one respect. Its economy and its social life are supported by an increasing volume of immigrant labor. Some Aspenites actually acknowledge the benefits of this arrangement, while others have another view. So let's rewind to the beginning of how we found out about this wonderful city and this issue of environmental privilege. On December 13th, 1999, the City Council of Aspen unanimously passed a resolution petitioning the U.S. Congress and the President to restrict the volume, the level, the number of immigrants coming into the United States. Why? Well, one of the reasons, the primary reason, for encouraging tougher immigration laws was the purported negative impact of immigrants on ecosystems, on the non-human environment. Concerns about immigration's impacts on the environment, of course, nationally, often focus on and perhaps fixate on the loss, the very real loss, of urban space, of urban green space, urban, suburban sprawl, overdevelopment of wilderness and agricultural lands, and many other problems. In Aspen, those issues are present, but more specific complaints include everything from high volume, or it's apparently high volume of car exhaust pollution associated with many older model vehicles that many immigrants drive to work there. Littering that is alleged to be associated with these folks who don't live here but have to work and eat there. And overpopulation, which might threaten the dominant Anglo culture that accompanies the stunning ecology of the Rocky Mountains. Aspen City Council member Terry Paulson, who's also a longtime immigration critic and self-avowed environmentalist, led the effort to get this resolution passed. He received support and guidance from nationally prominent immigration control organizations such as Carrying Capacity Network, Numbers USA, groups like that, who we can find quoted in places like Washington Post, New York Times, on Fox News on a daily basis. They reportedly told him, quote, other communities haven't had the courage to do this because many immigrants today are members of minority groups. So an effort to pass some sort of resolution like this to limit immigration may be seen as racist, end quote. So the goal of the Aspen City Council resolution was then to create a green city, to maintain a green city, a city beautiful perhaps in that progressive tradition, a beacon of sustainability and social responsibility. Unfortunately, underpinning this goal was nativist ideology, and they caught a lot of heat for that. But back to the individual who actually introduced this resolution, Aspen City Council member Terry Paulson. He introduced this resolution with the following statement, quote, fellow City Council members, the resolution we will be considering tonight for adoption could be the single most important consideration we will ever make as representatives of our constituents and their children. We have agitated, confused, and deluded ourselves with the illusion that we are being overwhelmed by many, many problems, when in fact we have primarily only one. But it is the one that terrifies us the most, and we handle that terror by chattering endlessly about everything else. Denying and minimizing population growth is a hate crime against future generations, and it must end. Please join me by passing this resolution and thereby ensuring a sustainable future for America and her children, end quote. So we read this and thought, wow. If you know your history of eugenics and population control in Germany, the United States, Russia, Latin America, Australia, this sounds like something from the 19th century, or maybe something as late as the 1920s, 1930s, when we were having these debates and the Supreme Court was making rulings on these sorts of things. But this was the year 1999, the very turn of the new century. So almost immediately after the city of Aspen passed this resolution, some people said, wow, well, was it unanimous? I'm sure there was some dissent. It was unanimous. Oh, all right, so maybe this is interesting. Went up to the county seat, though Aspen's the county seat, went up to the county commission, Pitkin County Commission. 2 months afterwards, they passed a similar resolution with the following statement, and I like this because if you're into logic, this statement makes a lot of sense. Quote, immigration is the leading cause of population growth in the United States. Population is the leading cause of environmental degradation, end quote. So you can do the math, you can make the link, right? Is it the transitive property? I don't know. One of those properties, you just make the jump. Immigration then is obviously, according to this logic, the leading cause of environmental degradation. So we must pass this resolution if we care about the future of America and her children. So like the Aspen resolution, the county's resolution underscored this long-standing link between nativism and environmentalism in the U.S. and elsewhere. And that county resolution was passed in the year 2000. So these narratives that define immigration, and let's be clear, this is not all immigration. This is certain immigrants. I was talking to some folks earlier about this. Had no problem with the Aussies coming to town to work in Aspen. Had no problem with Europeans coming to town to work in Aspen. The problem was these damn Mexicans, these brown hordes of people who were socially contaminating our otherwise pure cultural space. These narratives that define immigration from south of the border as a leading ecological threat really stand in stark contrast to the everyday reality of this playground for the rich and one-time famous, which depends, of course, on low-wage immigrant labor to provide the kinds of luxury goods and services that actually make Aspen function. That's an old story. So in some respects, this is a bizarre story of an environmentally friendly and conscious town whose city council can regularly approve the construction of yet another 10,000 square foot vacation home with a heated outdoor driveway so the owner doesn't have to shovel the snow on the driveway when they're driving their Bentley to perhaps, I don't know, the ski slopes. And simultaneously decry the trailer homes with the immigrants, perhaps the architects in them, just down the road as an eyesore. In other respects, it's a familiar story of an increasingly brutal inequality and accompanying uneasy racial, class, and citizenship demarcations that become pronounced, and even more pronounced as cities across this nation try to negotiate a fast-paced global economy and its flow of information, ideas, people, goods, and bodies. On the privileged end of the spectrum, most of these elite jet-setters with second or third homes in Aspen actually spend very little time there. Of course, I mean, it's a second or third home. There's only so much time you can spend in each of your 3 or 4 homes, right? And that's what a vacation home is for. It's for a vacation. But they often want their multi-million-dollar domiciles ready for them whenever they arrive. One property manager, one of many in the area, manages homes, and he says, look, the occupants, the owners are here maybe a few weeks out of the year, 45, 50-some weeks out of the year, they're not there. Yet, as he recalled, quote, they had to stay heated. The homes had to stay heated the whole time so that the pipes wouldn't freeze, and swimming pools, as a rule, were heated continuously, not drained, so that they'd be ready for use whenever the owners decided to arrive, end quote. One Aspen multimillionaire resident, a financier, raised a stake in the environmental community down valley, that is people in places like Basalt, Carbondale, Glenwood Springs, if you know the area, on down to Parachute, people who were already predisposed to being critical of Aspen, because he had some people dug out and haul away something like 15,000 cubic feet of earth, an entire hillside, for the noble reason of purpose of being able to see his horses better. There was a hill, this pesky hill was in the way, and he wanted to see his herd of horses. He thought this was perfectly reasonable for his quote-unquote cabin, a 7,500 square foot luxury home that sits on a 157-acre lot. So this is a land of excesses and contrast, to say the least. So Colorado is a place then where immigration and environmental politics have come to a head many times in its history. From Aspen to Boulder to Denver, from the eastern slope to the western slope, this state has struggled with how to maintain its labor force for some of its biggest industries, which include, of course, ecological resource extraction and tourism, while simultaneously trying to protect those ecosystems that are threatened by these very industries. So this struggle over immigrant politics is evident in the public discourse among Roaring Fork Valley residents of the town of Aspen, on up past down through the Roaring Fork River. And one long-running argument, evidence in this debate, which is one we've all heard because it's part of a national frame, is that the United States is, and in fact it may be, the most generous nation in the world with regard to its immigration policy. Other narratives and debates focused on the risks that immigration posed to quality of life, to public health, and security. Very reasonable concerns. The theme of America's benevolence or beneficence, and that anyone here should quote-unquote love it or leave it, was also prevalent in conversations that we had and in letters to various editors of all the newspapers that we were looking at in the valley. Mike McGarry, who's a vocal Roaring Fork Valley resident and leading nativist environmental activist, expressed some of these ideas in the following colorful language. This is to a letter to the editor, I think it's the Aspen Daily News. Dear editor, I just read your October 16th article about English-only opponents gathering for some conference, where one, Mr. Juan Antonio Garcia, who recently came from Mexico, was quoted as saying that the motives of the supporters of the English-only ballot proposition that was being floated in Colorado at the time are quote-unquote probably racist. Mr. Editor, can you imagine someone moving to Colorado from a junk country and retrograde culture, and within 2 years of his being in this state, bad-mouthing the people of Colorado while leeching off of their generosity? Senor Garcia, haul your arrogant, slanderous behind back to Crapville until you develop some gratitude and humility, and until you are reminded just how much you already owe the citizens of the most tolerant society you will ever experience, end quote. We also found scores of letters to editors invoking this quality of life argument you see articulated on a national scale. One resident wrote to the editor about his fear of immigration and the need for citizens to stand up. Quote, the regulatory power of our government was granted to us, by us, the citizens, and we need to ensure that our standard of living does not decline further, end quote. Wasn't it Obama, or was it Bush, maybe it was both of them, that said the American way of life is not up for negotiation, right? Similar rhetoric we see here. Finally, health risks and the fear of epidemics have been, of course, a traditional concern among nativists and governments regarding foreigners entering the country. We've seen this from Angel Island to Ellis Island. Any nation looking to enforce biopower through the medical system would sensibly be concerned about that. But fears of contamination have periodically reached hysteria and have contributed to the perception that poor hygiene and disease are inherent among some immigrant populations. One Roaring Fork Valley resident wrote a letter to a newspaper editor about his experiences of eating at a local restaurant. Quote, "I have issues with tuberculosis. I was exposed to that by an illegal alien at a restaurant who coughed near me, and it required that I get medical treatment. So please remind me that eating out isn't worth the souvenir of hepatitis A. Hepatitis A is also spread by hand-and-mouth contact and something that illegal aliens are not screened for," end quote. So these statements, while for some people might seem highly vitriolic, were actually highly representative of letters to newspaper editors in the valley, the Roaring Fork Valley, during the period of our study. And I think the point here is to give you a broader sense for how the nativist discourse sort of went beyond sort of strict environmental issues and might provide some support for a unanimous city and county resolution around this. I want to talk about an incident that came up during a visit that we made to the Roaring Fork Valley in 2004 that really underscored some of these tensions among the state, among native-born citizens, and among, frankly, Latin American immigrants. And this, frame it in the context of sort of post-9/11 immigration politics, where we really saw increases in nativism and hate crimes really spiking across the United States, and the Roaring Fork Valley was no exception. So this was the summer of 2004, and it was 1 week in the month of July, where word on the street was that ICE, Immigration Customs and Enforcement, La Migra, used to be INS, ICE was conducting raids throughout the valley, sweeping up people. The raids were said to have occurred at a gas station on Highway 82, at a shopping market in Carbondale, and at an area hospital, and at many, many work sites throughout the valley. Agents were believed to be rounding up, detaining people, including men, women, and children. The news spread so rapidly that the next day and for several days after that, a large number, an outrageously large number of men, women, and children stayed home from work, from school. People didn't go to the doctor, the hospital, no nothing. People were running scared, hiding behind closed doors, and employers were looking around going, where are our workers? Anybody see the film A Day Without a Mexican? This felt very much like A Day Without a Mexican, which isn't a very well done movie, but soon to be a cult classic, I'm sure. Anyway, it was a horrible movie, but very much, it was like, wow, this really is a day without a Mexican. There are no Mexicans. Where did they go? The place ground to a freaking halt. The only problem was that the news of this ICE raid was not news. It was a rumor. It didn't happen. Most of the public conversation, understandably, during the following days was focused on how such a rumor could have started. But for us, the more interesting question was why it had such an extraordinary impact throughout the area. Maybe that's obvious, but there were many theories about how this may have happened. It turned out that someone had seen, or claimed to have seen, a white van with people who looked like they were working for the government, rounding up brown people at a checkpoint on Highway 82, somewhere near Basalt, which is a town right outside of Aspen. And he called into a Spanish language radio station, Radio Tricolor, Radio Tricolor, and said, La Migra está aquí, they're here. Well, you know, people stay in your houses, be careful. And so it just spread like wildfire throughout the area. And we talked to a sheriff who was an immigration advocate, if you can believe that, a liaison for the immigrant community, Marie Monday, who told us that, quote, State Patrol always does a roadblock at that point for DUIs. David, do you know what day that this guy saw people getting thrown into a van? It was July 4th weekend. This was a sobriety checkpoint. And I talked to the cops there, and they said there were no ICE agents, immigration wasn't there, etc. But this one Mexican man called me and asked me about it. Again, she's a community liaison. He was the first one to call me when they had this DUI roadblock. He was in Aspen and afraid to go home to Basalt, just down the road. And he says, I can't go home to my children. And his wife was there, and they were both crying on the phone. Said, we can't go home to our children. And I said, it's okay, it's just a DUI roadblock, end quote. The Aspen Temporary Labor Service, which is exactly what it sounds like. They send people out on temporary contract basis to employers in the region. I talked to people there. The staff person said, yeah, you come into Aspen on any morning, about 6:45, and every day you will see droves of people, droves of immigrant folks coming in, driving here, looking for work. On those days, though, this place was a ghost town when it all happened, end quote. Peter Jessup, member of the clergy, Catholic Charities staff person, connected this post-ICE raid rumor and the sentiments back to September 11th, 2001. He says, to me it was an aftershock of what happened after 9/11. And this is a popular narrative. He said, that's how it played out in my mind. People were really afraid of being deported and were scared. I think immigration was going in the right direction before 9/11, but when that happened, it created a lot more fear and segregation, and a lot more problems. It just shows what level of fear there is in this community, end quote. So a rumor, false report, kicked off a community-wide panic, sent people running into the shadows, confined to their homes, afraid to even return home in some cases for fear of being deported, separated from family, friends, the community. Just the mere threat of deportation was made very real in the everyday lives of immigrants. And the seismic effect of this rumor, of course, reveals how tense relations are among the immigrant community, the Anglo community, and the state. And as those of us who've been following the deportation issue know that Obama makes George W. Bush look like a child in a playground when it comes to deporting people. He's deported more than 1 million people. It's a wet dream for George W. Bush. And has the right given him any credit for that? No. Why is he doing it? I don't know. That's a side note. This is one view, though. Immigrants running scared, Anglo-racism, the state coming down on people. There's another view, though. That Kino, a Mexican immigrant we spoke with about this issue, had. He framed it for us as a response to the day-to-day racism that he and other immigrants experienced at the hands of the police. He said, quote, there's a lot of discrimination in cars. It's terrible. They stop us with like 3 or 4 police officers because they think we have drugs. It's like discrimination. We feel it's very racist. We clean their houses. We take care of their dogs. We do what they don't want to do. We clean their houses. We need to be together, though. We need to get together. We could stop traffic until they listen to us. We didn't go to work one day, and the companies lost a lot of money, end quote. And he had this sort of eerie look of empowerment as he said this. So instead of seeing this episode purely, again, as an example of a crackdown, of repression, and people running into the shadow, Kino urges us to also think of this case as a demonstration of the power of immigrants to conduct, perhaps, a general strike and withhold their labor. And there are so few precious instances where undocumented persons are able to exert such public power over communities, over societies, over employers. And this case might be re-examined as another. And that all of this could happen in a city like Aspen, a place of unbridled serenity and beauty, I think makes that issue all that much more interesting. We also talk about this thing we call the Aspen logic. This is Newsweek magazine, a nice graphic. The logic of Aspen and the magic of environmentalism, where everyone is rich, white, and I might add, perhaps heterosexual, and happy. In recent years, this traditional fusion of environmentalism and nativism, of course, reared its head, ugly or otherwise, in this Colorado town, where ecologists sought to expel Latin American immigrant workers. And we want to consider both the roots and the implications of this development. And part of this led us to this idea of the Aspen logic, which is a way of seeing and shaping the world that preserves systems of inequality and injustice in a self-justifying manner. The Aspen logic appears to be a form of neoliberal discourse, perhaps with a green facelift, but it's not just found in Aspen. Think of the green wash that occurs when Dell Computer Corporation plants trees in various parts of the world while also producing tons of toxic waste for manufacturing its products. Or when Walmart sells low-energy fluorescent light bulbs while paying workers low wages and sourcing materials from sweatshops in China. But the Aspen logic is not just corporate environmentalism or a greenwash. It's also a whitewash because it includes social, environmental, and economic claims to purity, to goodness, to whiteness. That is, Aspenites, at least the City Council of Aspen and the folks who've quoted, link environmental sustainability to whiteness by excluding people of color and immigrants from this town via formal and informal mechanisms. The Aspen logic also, of course, hinges on the marriage of capitalism and environmentalism and has been a hallmark of Aspen's institutional history for years, far ahead of this alleged greenwash that we see at other in other institutions and companies. The director of environmental affairs at Ski, the Aspen Ski Company, talked about, we don't just use green power, green energy. We are making green energy. We have a hydroelectric facility on the mountain, and we are making our own property, our own green energy. We don't just have a green development policy. We have green buildings all over the mountain. The way that we do skiing and the ski industry is sustainable. And this was interesting because we had just come across a number of studies that make the claim that the ski industry is one of the most highly environmentally destructive sectors in the U.S. economy, contributing massively to soil erosion, deforestation, river and air pollution, and climate change. But the Aspen logic is a match made in heaven for green consumers and consumerism, and those of us who wish to, again, maintain our lifestyle while supporting environmental causes. For example, Aspen Magazine published a story about locals who love their scooters. The story read in part, "How green our town is extends beyond organic produce to the trend of environmentally friendly scooters. Not only are they the most stylish way to get around in the summer, they also make parking in our rather congested downtown considerably easier. In the summertime, Aspen proves that Rome isn't the only place where scooters rule." Maria DeGrave, manager of the Aspen Bulgari store and an avid scooter rider, is quoted as saying, "My Italjet gets a kabillion miles to the gallon. I never fill it up. And it's a lot more ecologically friendly than my SUV." Valerie Alexander, who works for Blue Green, which is a planning and design firm, talks about riding her vintage Vespa. She says, "It really takes me to another place." She says, quote, "I feel like I should be in Europe. Heading to lunch with the girls, my scarf blowing in the wind, a baguette in my backpack. Except I'm in Aspen," end quote. These references to Rome in particular and Europe in general are actually consistent with a long and conscious history of constructing U.S. ski towns as Bavarian or Alpine villages of the Rockies as rather exclusive European-like spaces. After all, the father of modern Aspen, Walter Pepke, who sort of re-engineered, re-promoted that town mid-century, lovingly referred to Aspen as the American Salzburg. And after World War II, ski resort promoters deliberately marketed these developments as European ski resorts within the American West. So the Aspen logic then reinforces nativist environmentalism. As Aspen City Council member Tom McCabe cautioned, he says, the planet is, after all, a finite resource. We cannot indefinitely welcome people that expect to maintain our quality of life, end quote. And I really appreciate that honesty, and that really sums up so much of what this all is all about. It's precisely the point. Aspenites and others in similarly privileged places across the United States want to protect their quality of life, which makes all the sense in the world. But that includes wealth, that includes resources and benefits derived from ecosystems that only they have access to, or from the hard work of others. So the innocent claim that these environmentalists and others are making, that we only want to preserve our way of life, is problematized by the very fact that such a lifestyle requires deep and sometimes harmful impacts on the environments that other groups of people live in, and of course the use of their labor. It also underscores an enduring belief, nativist environmentalism does, that there are essential differences between people of different ethnic, racial, and national backgrounds. A number of scholars, like Etienne Balibar, have recently described this sort of discourse, this sort of language, as a core part of what they call the new racism. This is a racism that no longer relies on these rather outdated and abhorrent notions of biological notions of superior versus inferior peoples. Instead, this new racism is based on the idea that there are permanent, incompatible, and insurmountable cultural differences and distinctions between people. So Lisa Park and I agree with scholars writing about the new racism that many sort of discourses about sort of the biology of difference and notions of racial difference have often given way to these other frameworks. But our focus on the immigration environment nexus reveals that such ideas are not entirely outdated. In fact, the case of the Roaring Fork Valley in particular, and immigration and environment conflicts in general, reveals that we observe both cultural and biological arguments at work. Because nativist environmentalists often claim that nations must obey the laws of nature in order to achieve and not threaten, quote unquote, natural biological balance of population and environment. And this, of course, is implied in terms that many of us, including myself, have used, such as carrying capacity and population environment balance. But in these cases, these terms are often cultural and political ideas that are sort of masked as scientific facts and therefore are often not open to debate in the minds of activists. So what are people doing to challenge nativist environmentalism? I talked briefly about that earlier. I'll just give a couple of quotes. A local resident worker, a Central American, Jose Cordova, told us what he thought about the claim that immigrants harm local ecosystems. He said, "I think that's a misperception, because I've been working for construction companies, and the mess that they do with that stuff, there's no ecological preservation. They just throw everything away. I don't think it's the Latinos affecting the environment," end quote. He also reframed the environmental problem as one that was perhaps rooted in inequality and power. He stated, quote, "My position is that this concept of overpopulation is not that accurate. That's one of the arguments that groups use to justify policies, to say there is poverty because of overpopulation. But if we go into the details about wealth and the land that are available, we see that maybe we may all fit into this world. I don't think the problem is overpopulation. The problem is redistribution of the wealth and redistribution of knowledge," end quote. I'm running out of time, so I could give several other quotes about how folks are challenging nativist environmentalism, but I will spare you. I want to, in the remaining remarks, talk about sort of trying to make sense of all of this. Recognition of the problem of environmental privilege is important, because there is this debate within environmental justice studies and environmental sociology about going beyond the distributive paradigm. And by distributive paradigm, people mean that traditionally environmental justice research has primarily focused on the uneven distribution of waste, of pollution, of toxics, etc. And how, again, where we find social inequality, we often find people struggling for clean air, clean water, and land. But many scholars, I think, have justly said we need to build on that, especially in terms of theories of justice. And Professor Banerjee has done some of the best work in that regard, and sort of asking the question, how do we define justice, and why are we only defining it in certain ways? And I think that work is important. But if I may, I think it also misses the fact that the distribution of power, not just the distribution of environmental harm, is and has always been the fundamental focus of what I would call critical environmental justice studies. Early environmental justice scholars actually went to great pains to point out that they weren't simply advocating for a more even or democratic distribution of environmental bads and negatives and hazards. They wanted to see the entire system that produced those hazards transformed. They argued that social inequality might be the actual root of the problem, and that is inherently a distributional question. Moreover, we would contend, Lisa Park and I would contend, that the dynamic nature of distributional politics and impacts has still yet to be fully explored. We aren't the first to talk about environmental privilege, but sadly we are, I believe, among the first. And that's a problem. We're just now beginning to pay attention to what we would call not only the flip side, but perhaps, if I may be so bold, if not the source of environmental inequality, this drive for privilege. And so the deeper distributional questions around where power resides, how power circulates, and how privilege, or the quest for privilege, drives environmental injustice are only beginning to be explored. So yes, we do indeed have a distributional problem that we can only move beyond when we've addressed the vast disparities in power within and across societies that produce environmental inequality and its partner, environmental privilege. So Aspen and the surrounding area, the Roaring Fork Valley, Colorado, is just one of many sites on the planet, perhaps built as a refuge from undesirable people and where nature can be manipulated for the convenience of a handful of elites. And we suggest that Aspen, Colorado, and many, many other places like it, and if you're interested for even a deeper exploration of environmental privilege, you should check out Rosita Taylor's massive first volume of 3, and I'm forgetting what it's called, Environment and the People in American Cities, 1600s to the 1900s. It's absolutely massive. Great book. These are models of environmental privilege and deserve closer considerations as sites for understanding, again, what we would argue are the roots of environmental justice struggles. In other words, Aspen illustrates the importance of understanding environmental inequality, of understanding poverty, by getting out of the hood, getting out of the ghetto, getting out of the barrio, getting off the reservation and moving into those places where raw racial and economic and political and cultural and environmental privilege are the order of the day. Sociologists used to do that. The fact that communities of color, indigenous communities, working class populations face greater environmental harm than the rest of us is indeed a social problem. And I think we need to continue to study that. But I think we also need to frame the existence of environmental privilege as a social problem, if not the source of environmental injustice. So I want to close with this slide. Slums of Aspen. This slide speaks to the title of our book, just in case you were wondering, and I just want to explain that. This last slide shows two contrasting images. Right? On the left here, we have a home that's sold for tens of millions of dollars on the real estate market in the Aspen area. The other is of a trailer park on the right side. Trailer park in the region. Now, when we, or certainly when I, generally or traditionally think of a slum, and just put that in your head, in your mind's eye, just imagine what do you think of when I say slum. We tend to think of a place on the other side of town. That is if you're lucky to not be living in a slum. Over there, across the tracks, where those people live and dwell. Places where one might say unsavory and maybe even destructive behaviors are the order of the day. And where, frankly, let's be honest, the homes, they're an eyesore. But I ask you, if you were to perhaps reorient your thinking toward a point of view that is critical of the ecological and global socioeconomic havoc that is wreaked by speculative capitalism and unbridled conspicuous consumption, I want to ask you now, taking a look at this slide, which of these two photos is the real slum? Thank you.
That's okay. And David agreed to take his own questions, so I'll just leave him up there if there are questions from the floor.
Yeah, happy to entertain any comments, questions people might have, rejoin me, critique. Yes, I'm here. Yes, yeah.
I know you kind of very briefly went into this. I was wondering if you could go into it a little bit more. Organizing against this inequality, organizing within the immigrant community, and also is there any organizing across the groups, like say rich people who have radical conscience? Probably some.
Right. Yeah, so the question is what sort of organizing is going on. Yes, I didn't get into that. Yeah, a whole chapter or two on that. And yes, there's definitely multi-class, multiracial organizing going on there. Within the Latino community, within the immigrant community, there were a number of groups, one of which was called Latinos Unidos, that has for years been organizing around a whole host of issues facing immigrant communities. Radio Tricolor, radio station, constantly has news, updates, conversation shows about events incidents that may be of concern to people, and about ways that people can address these issues. There are other media outlets, a guy, Luis Polar, who for many years and continues to pretty much self-publish a newspaper out of a room closet, and that newspaper is called La Unión. It used to be called, anyway, La Unión, and this is a bilingual newspaper, Spanish-English, and is, I think it's weekly now, used to be monthly, dealing with these issues and really highlighting issues of concern in the community, not just, of course, the immigrant community, but that affect, and that's really the point, that framing this as an issue as issues that affect us all. And there's also been, for many years, a center called the Stepstone Center for Social Justice, and I fear that center is no longer around, and that they've reorganized into another form. But that was run by a collaboration of native-born Anglo folks and Latinos who were working together. People like a guy named Scott Chaplin, Felicia Trevor, and Luis Polar, and many others. And actually it was Scott Chaplin from the Stepstone Center for Social Justice who was the individual who brought this whole case to our attention. And so they have organized hearings, rallies, petition drives. They were able to, one of the cases we talk about in the book deals with an INS. I don't think it was a detention center, it was a short-term detention center. I forgot exactly the language that they used, that INS, that ICE was trying to bring into the community. And these folks, a multiracial, multinational, multilingual group of folks came together to organize around that, to prevent that from being placed in the community. And they've also organized around an example in a trailer park community called the Bonanza Trailer Park Homes, where an owner was simply going to evict the people because a buyer was showing up in town and wanted to buy that up, and it was a lucrative offer. Unfortunately, they lost that, but there were many cases where people have come together across these various divides to work. And it's also really important that when those folks are recounting, many of those folks are recounting the history of what's going on, they'll actually point to the fact that working class white folks throughout the Roaring Fork Valley, certainly in places like Aspen and nearby cities like Carbondale and Basalt, that working class and middle class white people have been deeply affected by the economic situation and have been essentially driven out. I was talking earlier to John about how it's Leadville, places that are far, far away. Glenwood Springs is not. I mean, there are towns that are miles and miles down the road that it's very hard to afford a house in. So this group that is ostensibly about immigrant rights is trying to point out those connections. So yeah, thank you. Other questions, comments? Yes, over here.
Thank you for the presentation. I see the parallels between the United States, what's going on here in Greece, are astounding, in Europe in general, and the use of fear to kind of get rallying behind a certain policy. My question is, because the Greek state is heavily involved in creating these spaces. To defend society, we need to get the immigrants out, we need to deport them, we need to detain them, and things like that. To what extent is the United States at the state level or the federal level implicated in kind of creating these sorts of spaces for exclusion?
Yeah, I think deeply implicated, but I think I think we have to be fair. I think there is a good reason for what many might think is a very conservative narrative that I talked about, which is the United States is the most generous nation on the planet, because relatively speaking, I think it is fair to say that the United States has historically had a fairly, at times, very generous immigration policy. But as a geographer, David Sibley, who we quote in the book, who talks about sort of whether we're talking about immigration or we're talking about any sort of policy mechanism where difference comes into play, and we can read this as a landscape of inclusion, or we can read it as a landscape of exclusion. And I think, frankly, the answer is both. I run out of fingers when I count the number of overtly racist immigration policies that we've had in this country, going back to frankly, the founding of this country. But it works on so many different levels. Again, there are welcoming policies and ones that are exclusionary. And I think right now it's a very interesting time because we're having this national debate once again about to what extent are we going to be welcoming to, what is a different stream of immigrants than we've seen sort of historically pre-1965 coming here. And even the Republican Party, is getting religion on this in some ways. Not, out of any concern for immigrants, but of course out of pure sort of pragmatism. But at the same time, then we see in various states and cities passing policies that are rather draconian and quite hostile and in keeping with that history of exclusion. So I think there's no one answer. I think depending on what scale and where we are geographically, I think it's perfectly honest and accurate to say that the United States is both an extremely welcoming and extremely hostile society when it comes to newcomers. And so, yeah. But the state is deeply involved in it. And in fact, that's the whole point of a nation state. You read philosophers like David Theo Goldberg, and the idea of nativism, the very formation of the idea of race, he claims, is coterminous with the development of modern nation state. Right? We can debate that, we can argue that, but if you buy that argument, then we have to think, as I think you're pushing me, beyond the nation state if we're going to be talking about justice for any groups of people who have been aggrieved. And Nikhil Paul Singh says as much in his book, Black as a Country, that African Americans can never get justice in this country that was founded upon their exploitation, their devastation. Andrea Smith, many Native American scholars who are critical Native American scholars, say as much. With regard to the United States. The sovereignty of the United States is built on the continuing lack of sovereignty of Native American nations and tribes. And if you think that's vitriol, take a look at the Marshall Doctrine from 1823 to 1903 and on, a series of Supreme Court decisions that created this idea of subordinated sovereignty and stewardship. So yes, but I'm not a pessimist. I'm hopeful that we can think beyond the bounds of the nation state and beyond the bounds of citizenship, because I think while there are benefits, there are certainly benefits for people like me who do have citizenship, I think it's inextricably tied to exclusion, and that's just something I think we have to live with and struggle with. So, thanks. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a methodological question,
Okay.
which is, the quotes that you get are really fascinating and interesting and almost seem surreal at moments, where you actually have somebody referring to their SUV and commenting about, or talking about getting tuberculosis from Mexican servers. To what degree was that just the nature of the newspapers that you were working in?
Mm-hmm.
Like, was it just that the data you were working with was so rich in that way,
Right.
or is that the selection process that you went through?
Yeah. It's a good question. I guess I would answer it this way. Both the series of quotes about, oh, isn't this great, I'm living a green lifestyle, I'm a millionaire, and the series of quotes that are very, very nativist and very hostile to immigrants. We, during the period of study, were simply blown away. Surreal is the right word. We kept having to say, it's a very good thing that we keep going to Aspen and then pulling back, going hundreds of miles. We were living in California at one time when this was happening, because you had to step back in order to sort of evaluate this with any sort of objectivity or impartiality, because it seemed so insane and it seemed so unreal. But this was representative. And it didn't have to be. The Aspen Daily News, the Aspen Magazine, all of these sources, just random rags that you find on the street. People are just in love with themselves, in love with the town, and this, and as much as we are critical of nativism, look, as a sociologist, I get it. I totally understand. You feel like you've built this thing up. You feel like you've got something good, and for whatever reason, you construct, these outsiders as a threat to that. There's something very rational about that. There's something very comforting about, pointing to another as a scapegoat. But yeah, how do you sort of rationalize being, a very wealthy person and calling yourself an environmentalist? Well, I think, and I don't want to make too broad a sweeping statement, but I do think that, ultimately this book is also a critique of environmentalism, of mainstream environmentalism, as a movement that has largely been wedded to the condition of the privileged. And I think a lot of the very harsh criticisms of the environmental movement from folks from working class communities, communities of color, people who are trying to get by and feed their families, is very well founded, is justified. I think one of my chief frustrations with the environmental movement broadly speaking, in this country, is that it has, to my knowledge, never seen itself as a movement that has a lot in common with social justice movements in the United States. We've come close in many instances in many organizations, but as a movement, no. Not only, I've served on boards of directors of a number of these organizations and struggled and walked away in tears precisely because that was my agenda. People knew about it. I was pushing that, and people pushed back and said, "We're concerned about sustainability, David. Poverty, human rights, gender, race, justice, all of that. We'll deal with that later." Or that's why we have these other movements. So environmentalism writ large in this country has that problem, and that's one of the reasons why environmentalism as a movement in the United States is largely politically and culturally irrelevant. Yes?
I was curious, so what is Colorado's policy on the driver's license these days for immigrants? And because when you were talking about the stop, yes, it was for DUI, but if they're checking people's driver's license, you could in fact get picked up
Right.
for
So,
driving without a license.
yeah, oh, so meaning in the case of undocumented folks and
Yeah.
licensed? Yeah. I don't know where they are now. At the time, there was this debate about that. Of course, that was also going on in California, and we see that in other states. So I actually don't have the answer to that. If anybody does, I'd be welcome. But people were, and at this time as well, one of the very, very common themes in letters to the editors were, these Mexicans, they like to drink a lot. They're drunk all of the time. They love to drive, and it's not a very public transportation friendly area. Although during the day there are shuttles that go up and down Highway 82 for people who are getting back and forth from work. But at nighttime, perhaps less frequent. And there, let's be honest. There were plenty of DUIs, plenty of accidents where there were drunk drivers in this area, this rather rural area. But there was a heightened sense that people from south of the border were much more prone to this kind of behavior. And we need to also be honest. It gets really deep when in some cases we had immigrants saying, yeah, and you know what, the worst is when Latino cops pull us over, because in some cases they are the most hateful, they are the most racist folks, and they're speaking to us in Spanish about how retrograde we are and how we should be shaping up, etc. And we have, I think, a number of quotes in the book as well that deal with that issue, that it's not just sort of race in that sort of rather narrow sense, that it's about citizenship and who is recién llegado versus somebody who's been here a long time. And some of the most vitriolic anti-immigrant or nativist sentiment in Colorado and California comes from Latinos, and we need to be honest about that. Various analyses have shown, I think, very strongly that Proposition 187, which of course was ultimately beat down as unconstitutional, but this was the state ballot proposition in California back in, 1994, that would exclude people without documentation from basic access to healthcare, education, things like this. That would never have passed if it hadn't been for citizens who were Latinos, who were voting for that. So I think when we're really honest with ourselves, we have to say, this is a very complex issue. But no, that specific question, I don't have an answer. I thought there was, down here.
Going back to your Aspen study, I noticed that Robert Sampson's research concerning immigrant communities suggests that concentrated immigration facilitates immigrant revitalization, such as increased social control and increased community solidarity. Did you notice any of that?
Yes, and April, I'm forgetting her name, and Tomas Jimenez have done some work on this as well. I think they use the term immigrant replenishment, and I think they...
Revitalization, replenishment, yeah.
Okay, yeah, pretty, very, very convincing evidence of that with regard also to language acquisition and maintenance. And a graduate student I'm working with now is looking at a similar process in Dakota and Lakota communities of the upper Midwest. Absolutely. And this is a really good example of, and it connects to the first question, where the longer this community has been here, the more people moving in, the more institutions we see being built, the greater the level of sort of a sense of identity, a sense of comfort, despite the nativism and the conflicts, and a sense of empowerment. So absolutely. But we didn't draw specifically on Sampson's work, but yes, that would have been actually quite informative. Thanks. Yes.
Where are these developers and these transitional community members getting their definitions of sustainability?
It's a good question from many sources. I mean, Colorado is a really wonderful place. If you're in Boulder, Denver, Aspen, Snowmass, you have some of the leading scholars and thinkers and writers and promulgators of ideas around sustainability. The Rocky Mountain Institute, for example, places where people I think are doing really, frankly, just admirable work on sustainability. How do we design, how do we engineer a sustainable society? How do we think about and implement and discover and use appropriate technologies, if you will. So I think it's coming from a number of sources. There are also a lot of foundations in the state of Colorado and in the Roaring Fork Valley that are funding environmental thinkers, environmental organizations. Rocky Mountain High, John Denver, I think it was the WinStar Foundation, did a lot of great work, and I don't know if they're still around, still doing some interesting work. Not just sort of on, as me as a sociologist, I'm thinking about, let's talk about the state and industry and various institutions, but they were also funding work and interested in promoting work on a sort of spiritual and cultural level. So a lot of, we can joke about it, it sounds hokey, but I take it seriously. A lot of embrace and promotion of, say, Eastern spirituality, Eastern religions and faiths that people think are sort of more in tune with and more capable of recognizing the non-duality of humans and the environment, and refusing that sort of nature-culture divide. So I think there are a number of sources, and frankly, people who are flying in, coming to visit Aspen from all around the world. It's not just a place, we know it's not just a place to ski. Aspen is an incredibly vibrant place in the summertime and the fall. We have the Aspen Ideas Festival, there's the Food and Wine Classic, there's the music festival, all sorts of things. So there are, frankly, wonderful speakers and thinkers and advocates and leaders. People like Lester Brown, coming to town and talking about sustainability. So there are a lot of sources, in addition to some homegrown and home-based institutes, centers, places where people are, I think, producing some very important work. But that specific question, I think, gets, well, where is the nativism coming from? And that I actually don't have a good answer to. I think that's also coming from several sources. But when people have heard me present on this, like, oh, you're just giving a sort of selective kind of reading of a few kooks in the valley. I said, wow, those if they are kooks, then the entire City Council of Aspen, Colorado, the entire commission of the county of Pitkin are also kooks, because they unanimously passed this and felt that they had the support of the population to do that. So that's a long-winded way of saying it. I think there are multiple sources. And I want to give, as critical as I am, I want to give credit. These people read, they think, they debate these issues, and I think it is legitimate perspective. So I do take it seriously. Thank you. How are we doing on time?
We could probably have one more. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, over here.
I had a question about kind of this issue of critique that you addressed at the end,
Okay.
especially with the like switching around of perspective, which one's slum.
Okay.
Right? And so to get at the problem, I mean, it's really, you have to address it's a social problem, socioeconomic, right? And that's like one of the reasons population, it seems, can be used for various reasons, is because it's just a technical issue. You can switch it, it's separate from political, economic, social spheres, and so forth. And so given that that's the case, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. Seems like that might present problems if that's the diagnosis in face of like this nativism. There would be a reaction against that because you have to critique the society, but the society is like imbued with this religious, you can't touch it. So does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm
Can you clarify a little bit? I'm with you halfway.
So how, if to get to the root of this issue has to do with basically critiquing society and flipping our lens here, right? The people, there'd be a negative reaction against that, obviously. And, that's your thoughts on that. In terms of strategy, but also in terms of critiquing actual, diagnosing the issue.
Right. Yeah. I guess I'll answer that this way. I think I agree that that ultimately, this isn't just a critique of Aspen. It's not just a critique of environmentalism. It's a critique of society. Because, as Lisa Park, my co-author, who's the first author on this project, says, part of the thing about environmentalism is very similar to so much of it's not isolated. This is part and parcel of this society where we're ingrained in this culture of sort of competition and upward mobility, and so many of us don't have a problem with a place like Aspen, don't have a problem with a house like this, because we aspire, many of us, to something like that. We're sort of taught to. This is ingrained in many of us. And so environmental privilege is something that many people would think is perfectly normal and aspirational, right? And environmentalism is. And so that creates all sorts of deep problems, but precisely because, as we've discussed, this is founded on various forms of exclusion and inequality. But again, this may be a minority of people who are able to enjoy this thing, but perhaps one could say a hell of a lot of other people aspire to that. So I agree completely that I am going against the grain of probably much of society in that sense, and most people would say, yeah, so what? I'd love to be living in that house, and perhaps I can install some fluorescent bulbs and reduce the ecological impact. But really, what's the problem with that? And so, I don't know. I think, let me just go on a limb and say that I've been reading lately some kooky stuff. How would I put this stuff? Sort of anti-civilizational scholarship that I think is really scary stuff. People who say, yeah, David, you're being all critical of capitalism. Capitalism is a symptom. Let's go back 10,000 years. Let's look at the beginning of human agriculture, pastoralism, civilization itself. We need to undo that. We need to dismantle that. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. My tongue falls out, my jaw drops. I don't know what to say about that, but if you want to talk about people who will disagree with you on a societal level, I think let's have that conversation. And people I'm reading and people I'm debating are saying, well, you're not connecting it to that. There's nothing about this that you can't connect to the beginnings of human civilization, and you should be doing that. And say, you're going to go put on a suit and tie and go to a congressperson's office and lobby them about, hey, what about, okay, let's get that clean air policy passed. That's step A. Let's move on to step B, which is dismantling industrial civilization as we know it. What about it? You willing to vote on that, Congressman or woman? No, probably not. So there is a way in which we have to. I think these conversations. I'm actually not so much interested in trying to sort of convince the rest of society. I don't think that's. I'm not even sure that's possible. I'm interested in having these kind of critical conversations and see where they go, because I think we have to sort of step outside of those rather restrictive bounds. And that's kind of the point about being critical of the mainstream environmental movement, because the mainstream environmental movement is inherently an insider strategy. It's inherently a reformist movement. And I don't want to say they're never going to be talking about these things, but they haven't thus far. So I'm interested in the people who are interested in pushing that. And by the way, doing field work and living in a place temporarily like Aspen, it's kind of fun. So yeah, having your time doing that. No complaints there. So thank you.
Well, sir, any more? If you want to hear more about radical ecological politics, he'll be speaking again tomorrow at noon in 1210 McClung.
Okay.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much.